Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're here this morning. It is. This is such joy to be able to speak to my own church. I told the last congregation that I spent 40 years in pastoral ministry, so I spent 40 years leading a church. But since we've been here, I've been part of a church. You know, I'm just one of y'all, and so it's a different flavor speaking to folks that you're not trying to lead, and it's a joy for me to be here this morning. So we are going to continue on the series that Bob has had about marriage. And before I go too far, I do have to look up here and welcome the folks at home. We're glad you're here. And we're glad you're able to participate with us as we learn, as we listen to God's Word, and we learn how we can best live with one another. Barbara and I have been married for 50 years. And I would like to say it's because, thank you very much. I'd like to say it's because we are such mature and confident human beings, but the reality is we just didn't kill one another. But she thought about it sometimes, but In 50 years, you'll learn something, and that's what I'd like to share with you this morning is some lessons I've learned from 50 years of marriage. Now, our text for this morning comes from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, and there it says, "Submit to one another out of reverence to Christ." When I first looked at that verse, I said, okay, this is... We read that verse and then we immediately get into wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives, and that whole portion of Ephesians. And somehow in my mind, I always said, when we use this verse or when we look at this verse, the context for this is marriage. But in looking at it more closely, I think the context for it is life. Not only do we submit to one another out of reverence to Christ in our marriage, but we as individuals who are part of a collective organization, we submit to one another out of reverence of Christ. And so these lessons that I share with you this morning aren't lessons that we just say, oh, okay, I'm not married, so it doesn't apply to me, or I'm not in a relationship, or whatever. These are lessons that I believe each of us can apply in most of the aspects of our life. So we are to submit to one another out of reverence to Christ, but oftentimes our will and our willfulness gets in the way. How can we refresh our perspective and move towards a healthy, submissive attitude? That's what I want to address this morning. And before I really get into the lessons, I want to talk about who we are just a little bit. We are tripartite human beings. Isn't that a wonderful thing? You can write that down. You know, write it down and say, I learned a new word at church today. It's tripartite human beings, which means we are three-part. There's three parts to us. We are a soul. I am of the mind that our soul is created at the instant of conception. We become an absolute, distinct, unique, and eternal being. And that being is encased in our soul. Now, at conception, our soul arrives and we begin to build this body, and this body is the transportation for our soul. Our body carries our soul around. We are an eternal being that's housed in a body that is governed by our will. Our will tells our body where to take our soul. And sometimes our will can take us some places we ought not be. But regardless of that, it's our will that's in control. We have a soul that's housed in a body that's governed by a will, and it is our will really that we struggle with more than anything else. It is the thing that derails us. It's the thing that we need to learn how to manage. Now, the first lesson I learned in our marriage had to do with the will. Barbara and I, our first encounter was in 1973, and actually I believe it was in August of 1973. I might be wrong about that, but it was along about this time of year. And even though Barbara and I lived a little over a mile apart while we were in high school, we lived a mile apart. We rode the same school bus. I got on first. She got on last. I sat in the back. She stood in the front because there was no more seats for her and her sister most of the time. We rode the same school bus, and even though we rode the same school bus, and even though we lived close together, we didn't interact with one another. But in the summer of 1973, her people and my people got together at a gravel pit. It was the East Pit. It was just outside of town, and it was a cool place to go. Even though we had lakes all around us, the gravel pit was just outside of town. You didn't have to drive any distance to it. And so her people were there, and my people were there, and we were interacting with one another. And Barbara said something about not being able to swim. Now, I had watched a John Wayne movie where there was a little kid that told John Wayne that he wasn't able to swim, and what John Wayne did is he just picked this kid up and he threw him out into this creek. And from that, I assumed that swimming was nothing more than motivation. So, being a kind, gracious, wonderful guy that I am, I picked Barbara up and I dropped her in the gravel pit. And Barbara went down into about 6 feet of water, and she stood there, and she looked up at me. I could see the water rippling over her head. And I came to a realization that not everybody floats. So I jumped into the gravel pit to pick Barbara up. I picked her up. She jumped on my shoulders, and now I'm standing in 6 feet of water, looking up. That was our first encounter. We both got out of the gravel pit, or both got out of the water, and I apologized as profusely and repeatedly as I could. And a few days later, Barbara and I were again together, and I said something to her about, what are you going to do tonight? And she said, I'm going with you. And we have been together ever since. That following January, we got married. That following January, we had one son. The following, like a year past that, we had our daughter. And so in the course of 3 years, I had a wife and 2 kids, and my wife had a husband and 2 kids. And we came to a startling revelation that the home that Barbara had grown up in was so dysfunctional. She had no comprehension or context or understanding of what to do with kids. And she was completely and utterly overwhelmed. Now, some people, as we progress through this, some people labeled it mental illness. I would like to label it trauma recovery, because there really wasn't an illness there. There was just a circumstance where one had to learn how to adapt from a lack of knowledge or understanding or experience. We had 2 little kids, and I had a wife that was going through immense emotional, psychological stuff. And I started wondering what I was going to do. You know, in the world, a lot of choices get made about what's good for the individual. And I thought about that. So what's good for me? Should I take these kids and let her recover on her own? Should I just leave them all? I thought about that. I sat on our barn hill. Now, when you're from the Midwest, where land is flat, there is a hill. On many barns, there's a hill that comes up to the side of the barn that you drive wagons up so you can get into the threshing floor of the barn. And that's the barn hill. And where I come from, land is flat. So any elevation is something. And so I sat on this barn hill on a summer day. It must have been sometime in July or August, because our daughter was an infant. And I asked myself, what am I going to do? And after consideration, I said to myself, whatever this is, I have to be in 100%. And it was the first occasion that I recognized that the choice made here dictates all the other actions. The lesson I learned from that, and I mean that was the first occasion, but as we grew together, the lesson I learned is I control me. I have this will that wants to do this and it wants to do that, and it isn't that I just say, oh, I feel like doing this or I feel like doing that. I choose what I do. I choose when I'm angry, or there's times I get angry, but that emotion is mine. That emotion isn't imposed on me by somebody else. There is attitudes. It was an epiphany for me when I realized that I could choose whether I was going to be grumpy or not. You know, I was one of these teenagers that was always upset and bored. And I realized one day that I could choose whether I was going to be that way or not. I choose my attitudes, my emotions, my actions, and I'm responsible for those. There's nobody else that's responsible for my attitudes, actions, or emotions. I control me. Now, I influence others. I've spent my life influencing Barbara, and she spent her life influencing me. And we influence one another, right? You influenced your children this morning to get them up and get them here. Or maybe your spouse. I influence Barbara every morning at 8 o'clock. I turn the lights on. Right? Yep. So we influence one another, but we don't control one another. A lot of the trouble I see in relationships is when people try to control one another. And we really can't. I control me. Second lesson that I learned is that there is room to adjust. That's the lesson. Let me illustrate it this way. Not being very, very smart, one of the activities that Barbara and I engaged in sometime after we were married, because she is deathly afraid of water, we decided we'd go on a canoe trip. And in this canoe trip, I was instructed one thing. She said, I don't get wet. Okay, that was my instruction. Now, I am of the mind that proper canoe protocol is the person in the front of the canoe provides the power, right? You just paddle away. You provide the power. The person in the back of the canoe assists with power, but provides navigation, chooses where you're going to go. It's a real good deal if you can get everybody to work on it. So Barbara and I are going down the stream. She has instructed me that we're not going to get wet. I've said I will do my best. And we are having a wonderful day. It's the spring of the year. We're going down the AuSable River. The water is high. And typically in the spring, they haven't gotten down and cleaned out the banks yet. You know, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And as we're going down the AuSable River, there is a tree that has begun to fall away from the bank, and it's about a 45-degree angle out over the water. And the current is taking us to that part of the river to go under the tree, and I think there is going to be no problem at all. We can navigate this, and we can do it without getting wet. All we have to do is our job. She has to paddle. I have to navigate. We're doing splendidly. We get just under the tree. The front part of the canoe gets under the tree, and Barbara decides it's time to quit paddling. And the back end of the canoe starts to drift underneath that tree. And I start to lean just a little bit to get under the tree and avoid the spiders that are all hanging down from there. And before you know it, we're both standing in the river. I'm this deep. She's this deep, and we're holding on to the canoe. Everything that we had in the canoe was floating downstream. I'm standing looking at her. She's bravely holding her chin up out of the water. And my first response, the thing that welled up in me that I felt was the important thing to do in this instant, it crossed my mind that I needed to tell Barbara what she did wrong that got us into that situation. But I had an epiphany. And that epiphany was, what we do next is more important than how we got here. In our relationships, there needs to be room for us to adjust. I don't know about you. My life has not gone as planned. I make plans, and somebody says, you make plans and God laughs. And I know I've made plans, and some of them have worked out, but most of the time circumstances change. And those plans get set aside or adjusted. There has to be room to adjust in our relationships. A way to do that, let's hear these words from Paul. When we're dealing with one another, we remember that love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always hopes, always protects, always trusts, always perseveres. Love never fails. If we work in our relationships from a perspective of love, it will give us the buffer and the room that we need to adjust. The third lesson that I've learned is to practice accommodation. Now, I'm using the word accommodation and hospitality. I'm using them interchangeably. Hospitality is a principle that we find in Scripture. Scripture says practice hospitality. We have an example. We have a couple examples in the book of Genesis where there's some angels or there's some men that come upon Abraham, and Abraham jumps up and he runs to accommodate these strangers. He brings them more meat than they can eat. He makes them more bread than they can carry. He makes sure that he, to the best of his ability, takes care of each and every one of their needs. We see hospitality exercised just a chapter or so later with Abraham's nephew Lot, and in the class that we're leading, they're using Hebrew, so it's Lot, but I don't want to confuse myself by pronouncing something different than I'm used to pronouncing it. So I'm going to call him Lot. Lot, these same angels come to Sodom. They find the city square, and they are determined that that is where they will spend the night. And Lot is equally determined that he is not going to let them spend the night in the square. And as we read through the story, we realize that it's because he knows there is jeopardy there. But he insists that they come into his house. He insists that they sleep under his roof. They sleep under his protection, that their needs are cared for, that their cattle are fed, or their livestock are fed. This same kind of accommodation needs to start at home. Actually, if we're going to be hospitable, we have to practice it some way, so why not practice it at home? As I've gotten older, are there any fixers in the room? Okay, yeah. As I've gotten older, I've realized that it's easier to try to fix something than it is to help somebody else work their way through it. Right? When we practice accommodation, we create an atmosphere that provides for, protects, and promotes others. So early in my life, as early in our marriage relationship, as Barbara learned how to raise kids, I just got to say this, Barbara is a remarkable person. She is absolutely a remarkable human being. Because the home she grew up in, there was no instruction. There was hardly any food. There was nobody to feed them. They were sheltered from the elements, and they had enough to keep them alive, but nothing more. There was no example to learn from as far as how to raise kids. There was no example to learn from as far as how to relate to one another or to keep a house or any of that. So when she became overwhelmed with raising our kids, it was simply because she had no context to work from. But she did a remarkable thing. Even though she had no context, she taught our kids to read. I mean, our kids love to read, and that's because of her. She taught them how to ride bikes. She taught them how to keep their rooms clean. She taught them how to make tuna noodle casserole. The reason I cook today is because that's the staple. But I think back on where God has brought her and how God has worked in her. She had a career, I'm bragging on you. She had a career working in nursing homes, taking care of people. A career that she took great, great pride in. And she gave herself to it. I can't tell you the number of days she came home brokenhearted because she couldn't give as much care as what the people needed. You know, she's just a remarkable human being. When we look at where we started and we look at where we are, it's because, and you know, when I say these things, I know it's going to sound like I'm the hero here, but I'm not, because everything that we've done the same for one another. As we've practiced accommodation in our home, as we've worked, it's been one of my life goals to help her thrive and help her be the best that she can be. And she has done the same for me. She's my biggest cheerleader. She's the helper that God gave me. And you know, I just can't say enough about that. In our marriages, in our homes, in our lives, in our relationships, we do well to learn that I control me. I'm responsible for my attitudes. I'm responsible for my emotions. I'm responsible for my actions. It's that part of the will that gives us trouble. So I'm responsible for that. There is room to adjust. Barbara married me, and we began this lifestyle together. I was involved in, I was a herdsman for a dairy farm. So we got to a place where we had a very nice living. And you won't believe this, but when Barbara married, we were both hippies. But a number of years into our marriage, we got saved. Jesus came into our home. I'm jumping, Robbie, so don't move too quick on this. In Revelation, Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and sup with them and they with me." And there was a time in our home where we heard that knock and we opened the door and Jesus came in. And he began to transform us. And as he began to transform us, he changed the direction of our life. He changed the direction that we had planned for our life. I'm pretty sure that the direction he planned, we're right on it. But I got called into full-time ministry. And we left a very comfortable lifestyle to work for $4 an hour. As students going back to college. When our life was transformed and we started on this change, there was not internet universities at the time. So if you wanted to go to college, you had to go to college. And we liquidated everything that we had. And we moved. And I know the guys in here, this might not land as heavy on them as it will on the ladies. But she was willing to step away from all the security of a home and a community and follow me. That's big. That's huge. Receiving Jesus. Basking in his Spirit, feeding on his word, engaging with his people, enables our will to conform to His, and enables us to serve one another in the manner that He served us. So here's my offer to you this morning. Or simply a review, first a review. I control me. Everybody say that with me. I control me. Okay. If we can get our heads wrapped around that, it's going to go a long way in our relationships. We make room to adapt, and we practice accommodation, protecting, providing, and promoting those around us. We might need help with that, and the help that we need is offered through Jesus. As I said, He said, if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in, and we will be hospitable with one another. He helps transform our will and conform our will to His will. And John wrote that for all who have received Him, to all who have believed in His name, He gives the right to become children of God. Now, if anyone hasn't received Him this morning, that's His invitation. If you're here this morning, that is His knock. And it is simply a matter of opening yourself up to what Jesus can bring into your life. For those of you that perhaps you've been Christians for some time, but things are starting to come off the rails. Just a few passages earlier, to some who He said have forsaken their first love, He says simply repent and do the things you did at first. Jesus is more interested in where we go from here than how we got to where we are. And all we have to do is call upon His name.
Thank you for joining us today. If you feel like God spoke to you today and you would like to discuss your next right step with God, please visit cornerstonechatham.org, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and fill out the form to connect with us. We hope you enjoyed being with us today, and we look forward to seeing how God is working around Cornerstone in person and online.